Okay, let's talk about the relationship between the United States and Iran. It's easily one of the most complicated and misunderstood stories in the world today. And to really get a handle on the headlines we're all seeing, you have to peel back the layers of a long, and I mean long and tangled history. It's a story of friendship, betrayal, and just this incredibly deep mistrust.
I want you to picture this. It's January 29th, 2002. It's the first State of the Union address after the 9/11 attacks, and President George W. Bush steps up to the podium, and he says something that will literally echo for decades to come, putting Iran right in America's crosshairs.
And boom! Just like that, with those few words, the entire game changed. You see, this wasn't just tough talk. It became the actual framework for American foreign policy. And it caught a lot of people by surprise, including some of America's closest allies. That phrase would go on to shape international politics for years.
So how did people react? Well, they were split right down the middle. On one side, you had supporters, like the speechwriter who actually came up with the phrase, David Frum. For them, this was just speaking the plain, simple truth. They saw it as sending a message of hope to Iranians, saying, hey, we're against your government, not you. But on the other side, critics like Jessica Matthews were horrified. She called it a terrible strategic mistake, basically arguing that it backed reformers in Iran into a corner and handed a massive victory to the hardliners.
But here's the part of the story that's truly fascinating, the real twist. This level of hatred, this axis of evil stuff, it's a complete 180 from where things used to be. Because less than 30 years before that speech, the US and Iran were tight allies. So the billion-dollar question is, how did they go from being partners to sworn enemies?
To answer that, we've got to rewind the clock. We're going to dig into how what was once a real friendship completely curdled, and how a country that was once a trusted partner became a symbol of just deep, deep resentment. You know, it might actually surprise you to hear that for almost 100 years, America was seen as the good guy in Iran. Seriously. Unlike the old colonial powers, Britain and Russia, who were always meddling, the US was viewed as this trustworthy third force. Americans were helping to modernize Iran's finances, and after World War II, they were the ones guaranteeing its independence. The whole relationship was really built on goodwill. And then 1953 happened. This moment, right here, is what many people call the original sin in this whole relationship. So Iran's really popular prime minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, decides to nationalize the country's oil industry, basically taking it back from the British. Well, Washington and London completely freaked out. They were terrified that Iran would pivot to the Soviet Union. So the CIA and MI6 team up, orchestrate a covert coup, and kick out the democratically elected leader. They put the pro-Western Shah back in charge, and for millions of Iranians, that act of betrayal planted a seed of mistrust that has never, ever gone away. And after that coup, for the next 26 years, the alliance was incredibly close. The Shah was America's man in the Middle East, a key pillar against the Soviets. Washington sold him billions of dollars in cutting-edge weapons, and even helped set up and train his secret police, Savak, who were notoriously brutal. So you end up with this totally split perception. To the US government, the Shah was a great, stable ally, but to many, many Iranians, he was just an American puppet, and the US was the one pulling all the strings. And all that resentment that had been simmering just under the surface since 1953, well, eventually, it was going to boil over. And that leads us to the breaking point. 1979, the Euro Revolution didn't just change the relationship, it completely severed it.
In '79, massive protests filled the streets and toppled the Shah. But this was so much more than just changing the guy at the top. This was a fundamental reinvention of the entire country. The new Islamic Republic that rose from the ashes was built on a foundation that was proudly and aggressively anti-American.
And you really can't get a clearer picture of this new ideology than from the revolution's leader himself, Ayatollah Khomeini. He didn't just see America as a political opponent. No, to him, the United States was the great Satan, the absolute source of all corruption and evil in the world. This wasn't just talk either. This hatred became terrifyingly real when student militants stormed the U.S. Embassy in Tehran. For 444 agonizing days, 52 Americans were held captive. For an entire generation of Americans, this single event became the defining image of Iran. It burned this picture of hostility and extremism into the American mind. After the hostage crisis, the relationship entered a new and, frankly, even more dangerous phase.
This is where we get into the nuclear standoff, the conflict that has really defined the tension of the 21st century. Now get ready for a pretty stunning piece of irony. The Iranian nuclear program, the very thing that is the source of so much global tension today, was actually started with help from the United States. Yeah, you heard me right. Back in the 1950s, President Eisenhower had this Atoms for Peace program, and through it, America gave the Shah's Iran its very first nuclear research reactor.
But of course, after the 1979 revolution, the context for that program changed completely. What was once a symbol of peaceful cooperation became a source of intense suspicion. The US and its allies became convinced that Iran was secretly using the program to build a nuclear bomb. And that deep suspicion, well, that brings us full circle. It was the key reason President Bush gave for putting Iran in the axis of evil.
This long standoff eventually led to a massive, historic attempt to try and solve the whole thing through diplomacy. It was like a brief thaw in a very long Cold War. But it would lead to a landmark deal, and then its dramatic collapse.
So let's quickly break down what this deal actually was. In 2015, after years of grueling negotiations, Iran and the world's major powers reached an agreement called the JCPOA. The bargain was, at its core, pretty simple. Iran agreed to drastically limit its nuclear program and allow inspectors to go anywhere to verify it. In return, the world powers agreed to lift the economic sanctions that had absolutely devastated Iran's economy. But the deal was hugely controversial right from the start. And then, in 2018, the US government made a stunning reversal. The Trump administration unilaterally pulled the United States out of the agreement. The sanctions didn't just snap back, they were intensified under a new policy of maximum pressure, which was designed to completely cripple Iran's economy. And all of that brings us to our final and maybe most critical question. Are these two countries just locked in a permanent cycle of conflict? Because the collapse of that nuclear deal pushed both sides from a policy of maximum pressure right to the very brink of an actual war.
The aftermath was swift, and it was dangerous. First, Iran started enriching uranium again, breaking the old deal's limits. Then you had mysterious attacks on oil tankers in the Persian Gulf. Then Iran shot down a very expensive U.S. surveillance drone. This tit-for-tat cycle hit its peak when the U.S. assassinated Iran's top general, Qasem Soleimani. Iran retaliated by launching missiles at U.S. bases in Iraq, and for a moment there, it felt like an all-out war was terrifyingly close.
And that's what leaves us here. From that early friendship, to the betrayal of 53, to the revolutionary break in 79, and now the nuclear standoff, this is a story defined by just profound, deep-seated mistrust on both sides. So after all this history, the question we're all left with is the one you see right here. Is a different future even possible for the US and Iran?